I've been covering every little bit of new information about the BMW R18 because, to be honest, I love making videos about bikes that are a bit daft. You know, the ones where the manufacturer is trying something new or something that isn't entirely sensible. If I get a press release in my inbox about a generic middleweight bike that has a new TFT screen for next year, it's a bit difficult to get excited about it regardless of how many units they might shift. But put a 1.8 litre boxer twin in a cruiser with cylinder heads so big that it looks like they'll be scraping the tarmac at even the notion of a corner, and yes, you've got my attention, BMW. Same story with the Rocket 3. Nobody needs a 2.5 litre motorcycle, but it's way more interesting to talk about than another bland bike. So I made loads of videos about that too. All that said, BMW are really milking the release of the R18. First there was a wacky concept bike, then another one, then a really nice one that was a bit more realistic for production, and then at EICMA 2019 something a lot closer to what we can expect from the final bike. That might still have been a disappointment for some BMW fans though, as the motorcycle press was speculating that the finished production R18 was going to be unveiled at the show this year. It was, after all, almost a year on from the first concept, and some BMW dealers in France were apparently at the time already taking deposits. And yet here we are, December 2019, and still no full bike announcement, but there's been a little bit more information released about the whopping big motor, and so that's what we're going to take a look at today. The 1802cc flat twin, which has been named the Big Boxer, is apparently good for 90 horsepower at 4,750 RPM, with the red line arriving at 5,750. 90 horsepower doesn't sound like a great deal, but realistically it's torque that will be of concern to potential buyers, with BMW explicitly stating that they're going after Harley and Indian's market share in the US with the R18. Edgar Heinrich, chief designer at BMW MOTORAD, told Bike Exif, "From the market inside there's this request. There's a huge market, and for a long time we haven't really put a foot in the American market with our bikes. I mean, there's the GS and there's the RR, but in the big chunk where the cruisers are, we don't have the right bike." And you can see what he means when you take a look at the sales figures. BMW and Harley sell a similar number of bikes globally each year, roughly in the region of 200,000. But where Harley sells over 60% of their bikes in the US, BMW sells less than 10% of theirs. So that's roughly 100,000 fewer than Harley. That's a huge number, so you can see why BMW has invested so much in coming up with this new model with a totally different character to their existing range in order to try and crack this market. And it'll take quite something to overcome the American brand loyalty towards Harley-Davidson, but a good starting point is to emulate the super torquey nature of the big heavy V-twins that sell so well over there. So the R18 is expected to make 117 pounds-feet or 158 Nm of peak torque at 3,000 RPM, with the majority of the torque available between 2,000 and 4,000 revs. For a bit of context, let's have a look at the specs of Harley's recent Milwaukee 8 motor, which is available in their Softail and touring bikes and comes in a 114 cubic inch variant, which is just over 1.8 litres, so pretty much the same capacity as the R18. That'll do 155 Nm at 3,000 RPM and 92 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. So those specs are almost exactly the same as the R18, and it's hard to believe that that's a coincidence. The character of the motors will be very similar, with tractor-like strength at low revs, and I've got to say, I rode the Harley Fat Bob with the 114 motor recently, and it feels like it could pull your arms out of their sockets at full throttle. Indian updated their Thunderstroke motor for 2020 with a 116 cubic inch variant that was previously only available as a big bore kit. That's a bit more capacity than the Milwaukee 8 and the R18, and it has more torque to show for it, with 170 Nm produced at 2,900 RPM. No power figures were released, but estimates are in the 90 horsepower ballpark, so again we've got a pretty similar setup. Indian also announced their more contemporary water-cooled Power Plus engine for 2020, which will go in their new Challenger bagger, and it has a higher revving nature with similar torque but at 3,800 RPM and a lot more power, with a peak of 122 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. These gains are most likely down to the more modern technologies employed, such as liquid cooling that we've already mentioned and overhead cams, but Indian have stuck with the traditional air-cooled air-cooled 2-valve pushrod Thunderstroke on the majority of their big tourers for next year, and one can only assume that this is because of how they expect their customer base to react. It appears that they're going to transition to the more modern Power Plus gently, whilst folks get used to the less traditional design and therefore feel. Anyway, this is all relevant to the R18 because it's packing some old school tech too, but kind of out of necessity. See, it needs a large 1.8 litre capacity in order to generate those torque figures to get on par with the American bikes. But unlike the V-twins of Harley and Indian, the flat Boxer cylinders stick out either side, and it gets pretty damn wide given that each one will be 900 cc's. One of the ways that they've tried to keep it narrower is to use pushrod driven valves rather than overhead cams, which would have added more length to the cylinder head. So yes, a more traditional pushrod design might appeal to the American cruiser market, but it's also a practical design consideration. The earlier prototypes of the R18 appear to be entirely air-cooled, although the most recent R18-2 has an oil cooler visible, as did the test bikes that have been captured by spy shot photographers, and in this specs reveal, BMW confirmed that the bike will indeed be air and oil cooled when the final bike makes it to production. There are, however, some more modern touches to the motor, with 4 valves, dual ignition, intake manifold injection, and BMW's BMS-O engine management system. BMW have even incorporated what they call a self-reinforcing anti-hopping clutch, which is what most other manufacturers call a slip assist clutch, and this is a first for the dry single plate clutch that goes in their Boxers. So it's a bit of a hybrid of tech old and new, and it'll be interesting to see both how it goes down with customers as well as how it performs versus the competition. Given that the power and torque specs are so similar, in a straight line I guess it'll come down to weight. There's absolutely no indication of what the final bike will look like, let alone weigh, apart from the 110 kilograms of the motor. On the one hand, BMW generally make lighter bikes than either of the American manufacturers. Their biggest tourer, for example, is the K1600 GT, which comes in at 319 kilograms, whereas most of the Harley tourers are in the high 300s, with some of them getting up to and over 400 kilograms. But on the flip side, BMW announced that there will be a reverse gear option for the R18, so it sounds like they've got some pretty heavyweight variants planned. Anyway, what do you guys reckon? Will the R18 have what it takes to tempt Harley owners away from their brand? It's a big ask, but it looks like BMW are going all in. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next video.